Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Industrial Packaging Podcast with me, your host, Nathan Dube, Digital Marketing Specialist at Industrial Packaging. On today's episode, we have very special guest, Lisa McTigue Pierce, Executive Editor of Packaging Digest. Lisa, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. You did a great job with the questions, and I'm so looking forward to our conversation.
So without further ado, why don't we jump into the first question, which is, many companies are talking about sustainability and quote-unquote going green with their packaging, but sustainable packaging can be a complicated topic due to greenwashing. How would you define the term sustainable packaging?
Well, I would say that if we're going to be looking at the big picture, let's look at the big picture. So one of the pieces of advice that I would give to brand owners is to really keep top of mind why they're doing what they're doing. Is there really a positive environmental improvement? And quite frankly, Nate, that's where life cycle analysis, or LCA, really comes into play.
Okay, so Lisa, you brought up LCA, life cycle assessment. Some of our listeners and readers are probably familiar with this topic, but others are not. Could you give us a brief overview of what LCA means?
Sure, it really does look at the entire life of a product or a package. And so you're looking at it from the point of view of not just what the material is and then its end of life, but you're looking at it from the beginning of life. What is the raw material? How is it manufactured or processed? How is it transported? How is it filled? The process of putting the product in the package, how efficient is that? And then the transportation, again, wherever it is going from product manufacturing to consumption. And then, of course, end of life. Most people, when they're thinking about sustainable packaging, they really do focus on end of life. And there's a good reason for that, because that's where the consumer is pretty much focused, because that's where they're participating in the whole process.
Yeah, I think you bring up some good points. When I think of LCA, I think of everything that happens from the time the raw materials are turned into the actual packaging, and then whether they end up in a recycling center or, if it's something like a biodegradable material going to an industrial composting facility or your backyard composting pile. There really is a lot of moving pieces in that. And I guess the question that it often comes down to me is carbon footprint. And I think it's something that people are starting to talk about this, but I would say at the beginning of the year, I had a lot of conversations with some other guests on the podcast, and many were shocked to find out that plastics, for the most part, have significantly lower carbon footprints, which isn't just due to the transportation, that certainly plays into it. But when we think about, reusable packaging and programs like Loop, I believe we do have to scrutinize the materials that are being used, because while you could use a metal container to package Haagen-Dazs ice cream or, a similar product, they're significantly more heavy. So we know they are producing more carbon during transportation, but I believe that is likely true for other aspects of the entire life cycle. What do you think is one of the most key considerations when it comes to LCA for consumers today when they're trying to figure out, what product should I buy? What's most sustainable for the earth?
Yep. A couple of things here. Number one, I think you are dead on that carbon is going to be the measurement going forward. And it's actually been the measure in the past as well. Probably about more than 20 years ago, the interest in the environment was really heating up. So we've been in consideration of how packaging is impacting the environment for a long, long time. And at the time when it started to be more important here in the United States in the early 2000s, there was a lot of thought and talk about how do we make this easy for the consumer? Is there a way that we can compare apples and apples and have a label on every single package that tells consumers buy this, not that? And there really is no such thing, except if you look at it from a carbon footprint point of view, which you've already talked about carbon. So I think that that may be the measurement going forward. But there's a lot of different ways of measuring carbon, and we already talked about life cycle and doing that. But there's a lot of different methods for determining the life cycle, and some people call it analysis, some people call it assessment. So I use those terms kind of interchangeably. There are some people who say, nope, 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 it's not assessment, it's analysis. And there's just as many who say, nope, 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 it's not analysis, it's assessment. So once we say LCA, I just go with LCA and let people determine which A they want to use.
Yeah, I think that's really good feedback, and I would agree with you. I've definitely met people who are very intense about which term they use, but it's interesting you bring up, LCAs and some of these other topics we're discussing as challenges for brands, which I think is a nice segue into the second question, which is what are some of the biggest challenges for companies who want to switch from traditional packaging to sustainable packaging, and what advice would you give to a business that is looking to become more earth friendly?
Sure. Again, I think my advice would be keep in mind why it is you're doing what it is that you're doing. And so once you decide what it is that you want to do, then you have to figure out how you're going to communicate that to the consumer and leverage it as much as possible, which is not the same thing as greenwashing, not even close. Because I totally believe that companies should get credit for the good that they're doing. But again, I'm going to sort of play devil's advocate here. Answer to that question first, though. Is there really a positive environmental improvement in this package that you've selected versus other options? And being able to figure out how to take something that might be pretty complex to explain and simplifying it so that it's easy for even the uneducated consumer. Oh God, I didn't mean it that way. Unsustainably educated consumer to understand is not easy. That actually is probably where the brands who are successful at doing that are going to be more successful just in general. Because even though it's not hard to understand packaging and very specifically sustainability within packaging, it is pretty complex. There's ins and outs that you have to explain, and sometimes that's not the easiest thing to do on a package, because the best communication between brands and their customers are really on pack, and you're limited in the space that you can have and things. And I'll give you one example, Nate. So compostable packaging, for example, you had, when you said industrial compost, and then you said and or in your backyard, so you get it, you understand that there's two different environments for compostability, and a package that works in one environment is not necessarily going to work in the other. So for compostable packaging, there's situations where it makes total sense, absolute sense. Like, why would you not use a compostable packaging in this situation? Food service, if for example, you can't really recycle food service packaging because it's been contaminated with food. So, and if it's contaminated with food, it's perfect for a compost facility. They want that leftover food to turn into very healthy and nutritious compost. So that's an area where compostable packaging makes total sense. But in other areas, it really doesn't, especially if it's a food package that, but there's other examples where compostable packaging really doesn't make sense. For example, if it's a food package that other brands have a package that's easily recyclable and yours is compostable, but it looks pretty similar, it's going to be too confusing for the recyclers to weed out that compostable packaging from all the other recyclable packages that are in there. But as you can see, just this one example, it took me a while to go through it and explain it. And that this was only like, the high level stuff, the big stuff. So being able to educate consumers easily and quickly on what really is what from a package sustainability point of view is, I think, going to be the biggest challenge for brands. But there's one other thing I wanted to mention. There are a lot of sustainable packaging options out there now, which is great. But deciding which is the best one is kind of getting harder for the brands because a packaging change, anybody in the packaging industry knows, affects so many other business areas, financially, the supply chain, manufacturing. Does the new package run on your production lines? Marketing, again, this message to consumer. So the at the in packaging departments, the doing the analysis and the justification of a packaging choice is getting interesting. However, doing an LCA really does put hard numbers to each of those options that are out there and might help not only make the decision, but also justify the decision that's been made.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. Over the course of this year, again, LCAs are something that I focus more on. I've been trying to find studies of life cycle assessments from various academic resources, and I have found some. Most of the academic research and peer-reviewed information that I've come across, much to my surprise, is sort of leaning towards the idea that in many ways, plastics are one of our most sustainable options, which when I first joined the packaging industry 4 years ago, was one of my main concerns with choosing this career. Like, is this something that I want to be involved in? Do I want to be connected to an entity that is selling plastic? Because at the time, I had considered myself an environmentalist, and I had been reading a lot about recycling and disposal systems and various other elements of that within the environmental mindset. And I was really shocked to find that, there's a lot of misinformation passed off as, scientific fact, and even in mainstream and major media. I think that LCAs are valuable because it's something that can pretty much allow a consumer or a company to make a decision if it's the right thing for them. And I think that's very important because, as you said, everything is becoming more complicated as we move into the future. And, I think it's fair to say, I know as a consumer myself and friends and family who are consumers, we're always looking for things to become more simple. And, you mentioned compostable packaging, which is pretty revolutionary in and of itself, but that itself has become complicated. We recently started selling a biodegradable stretch film, and I had to write an article on the difference between biodegradable and compostable, which might seem like splitting hairs to some, but the film that we sell, it cannot go into an industrial composting facility or a backyard compost pile. It needs exposure to light, oxygen, and heat in order for it to properly biodegrade. And there are competitors' products on the market that are the antithesis of that, literally the exact opposite. If they don't go into an industrial composting facility, they will not break down the way that they're supposed to. So as we are seeing the evolution of sustainable packaging moving to the future, there's a lot of exciting stuff going on, but it does seem to be becoming more and more complicated, as if things were not already complicated enough. And I'm going to bring up single stream recycling, which I think is a good segue into the third question, which is once considered a game changer in the
Oh,
recycle. Oh, go on.
I'm so sorry. I am just curious, so I have to ask you a question. You've obviously learned a lot as you've been going through this. You said that you're, an environmentalist, and yet you've learned a lot about packaging over the last, what did you say, year or so?
Well, no, I mean, I would say the past 4 years.
4 years, okay. So my question to you is, it sounds like you have changed your mind about the value of plastic packaging. Is that because of the knowledge that you've learned? Is that true?
Yes, I would say that that's fair. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say that, like, plastics are blemish free. There's absolutely nothing wrong with them, and they're great, and everything is overblown. Although a lot of it is overblown. I mean, yes, there's problems with plastics in our waterways, oceans, rivers, streams, and etc. But when I looked at some studies, the real numbers are a lot smaller than what's often being reported. And while that is definitely a problem, I mean, perhaps the Earth would have been better off if plastics were never invented. But as a byproduct of the human species, I don't know if that would have been possible in the long term of evolution. So with that being said, where we are at today, in my opinion, based on what I've read up to this point, and as science is always changing, and peer-reviewed research can change what we believe in the past until that change comes, it would appear to me that in many ways plastics are truly one of the most sustainable packaging materials that we currently have when compared to the alternatives, if for no other reason than carbon footprint, first and foremost.
Right. Okay. Thank you for admitting that, because it proves, Nate, that consumers, the average consumer, now I know you're in the industry, but at the beginning you weren't, So an average consumer can understand this. It's complex, but it's not hard to understand. There's just a lot of pieces to it. Lay out the pieces one at a time, put them in the right order, and you know what? The vast majority of consumers are going to get it, just like you did.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And I mean, it's a, I consider it a privilege to be working in this industry. And, if I hadn't taken this career path, I wouldn't know these things about plastics, and I might be treating them the way that, many people do today, which, I mean, I go on LinkedIn every day. I can't tell you how many articles I see people talking about, oh, this major brand just switched to this, a cardboard alternative to plastic. And, my first thoughts are, well, that you're literally going in the opposite of progress. And while that might look good to people and make people feel good because it's 100% recyclable, especially for food products, like you mentioned, contamination, if it gets grease or whatever on it, the chances of it being recycled, particularly in single stream recycling, is very unlikely. And even if you did get to recycle it 100%, the carbon that you're producing during the life cycle is going to be 9 out of 10 times significantly more than whatever the plastic alternative would have been. All right, so question 3, Lisa, is once considered a game changer in the recycling industry, today, single stream recycling is sometimes seen as problematic for earth conscious people and businesses due to contamination and other dynamics of the single stream approach. What are your thoughts on single stream recycling as it relates to packaging and sustainability today?
Consumer confusion as it relates specifically to packaging recyclability could be solved overnight. Overnight. I'm a huge proponent of the How to Recycle label from the Sustainable Packaging Coalition. Do you know it?
I believe I've read an article about it. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert, but I've certainly heard about it.
Okay. It's simple. It doesn't take up a lot. It's elegant in its simplicity. I can't even stress that enough. It doesn't take up a lot of space on a package, which is usually the first argument and or complaint from brands, because space on packaging is always finite, and people fight for a lot of different things to put on a package. But this small, elegant label communicates exactly what it needs to. It answers the consumer's questions about whether each component of a package can be or should be recycled, and then how. I have to confess that even though the interest in the environment has been around since the 1970s, I was very slow to become a recyclable household. A lot of reasons for that, but it doesn't matter. You know, those excuses don't really matter. But I have to say that now that I'm doing it, I have to boast my single stream recycling materials are pristine and they're ready, ready, ready for easy sorting and easy recycling. So, okay, I'm going to admit I might know a little bit more about packaging recycling because of my job than the average consumer might. But like I said, that could be solved overnight with just putting the how to recycle label on every single package. So, you know what? Now, let's do that and then move on to other problems like how to make the materials that are recyclable economically valuable, which is kind of leads us not to go too quick too soon, but it leads into your next question about post-consumer recycled content.
Well, I do look forward to having that discussion, but before we do, I'll make some commentary on what you just said. Um, as for those instructions for sustainable recycling, I'm going to go ahead and assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's probably not mandated that all packages have to have that. And if that was a mandate, do you think that would improve the simplicity for consumers and businesses alike to get more of these materials recycled?
It would, it is not a mandate, and I don't think it ever will be. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think it will be. It's done voluntarily, and there are a lot of brands, both major brands and smaller, what might be emerging or entrepreneurial brands that are using it. And the ones that are using it really do see the value in using it. But this is only one piece because recycling is an entire industry and there are so many other players in it. You've got the collection and the sorting, whether by hand or by machine. You've got recyclers. But the bottom line is they have to have a market. They're in that for a business. And you have to have a market for the materials that are collected and then recycled, however it is that they're recycled. So that's one of the reasons why post-consumer recycled content to me is pretty key to making the entire cycle work the way it can and should work.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. My father used to work in the waste management industry, and he's mentioned, in the past, China was importing a lot of recyclable materials to their country. I don't know, what percentage of that was actually recycled or what the ultimate fate of those materials are. I know that the value of recycled materials for specific waste management companies, I'm not going to name anyone in particular, dropped when we stopped being able to export a lot of that material. And as such, things that should have been recycled in certain circumstances did ultimately end up in a landfill. And as we are, living through these times and in this transition, I think this would be a good time to go to the next question regarding PCR and PIR, because I think in a way that is a solution to at least a couple of these problems. And the next question, number 4, is actually one of the hot topics in our industry today is PCR, post-consumer recycled, and PIR, post-industrial recycled packaging materials. How do you think companies that want to offer more PCR packaging can start doing so?
First, I just want to make a comment about post-industrial recycled. Smart manufacturers have always been doing this because it's just smart business. And any company not doing it should, unless, of course, it's not allowed by regulations. But I got to tell you, I would probably even fight back on that one too, from a regulatory point of view, because when a process is controlled, like in manufacturing, material quality is also controlled. So you're really using, reusing virgin material, in my opinion. Now, post-consumer. So this is where, to me, the egg is more important than the chicken. It has to be economically viable to collect, sort, and process the material. And the poster child of this for packaging, in my opinion, is probably PET, polyethylene terephthalate. Number one for the resin code. There's a lot of people still using the resin code as incorrectly as a recycling identification. But everybody knows. Yep. Number one, it's recyclable. Most bottled water is in PET containers. PET is used for so many products, foods like peanut butter and pasta sauce, personal care products, probably shampoo, face creams, a ton of beverages, bottled water, as I mentioned already. And most of the beverages are single serve, like sodas and juices, but the PET is also used in multi-serve, family size bottles as well. And the reason why I talk about PET is not only is it widely used, so a lot of packages that are sold are PET, but it's also widely collected because it has a very well-established infrastructure. So almost any consumer who has curbside recycling knows that number one, plastic is recyclable. Put it in your curbside bin. And then on top of all of that, the recycled material, the material after it's been recycled, so recycled PET or rPET, as it's often called as well, is in high demand for recycled content in subsequent packages. So Nate, why would anyone, if you're in PET right now, why would anyone move away from that just because it's plastic and move to some other packaging material?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first answer to that would be, public opinion, which going back to the beginning of the conversation, right now, today, if I was to pull aside a random friend or family member, I think most would probably reiterate things that they've heard in the media, whether that be mainstream media or alternative media, because plastics, as we'll discuss in the next question, has just come under such severe scrutiny. And it's, easy to have emotions of, extreme hostility toward plastics when in the media they show you pictures of quote unquote the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which based on the research I've done isn't nearly as big as the numbers that are being perpetrated in a lot of major media articles. And I suppose that would be the reason why. Now, of course, on the professional side of things, corporations and businesses who are involved with PET, I would imagine that they are well educated about these things and obviously want to use it and recycle it as much as possible. I would suspect the biggest challenge in that is getting the public to understand the value of it, not only from a financial standpoint for the companies who are using it, but also as a recyclable material and a truly sustainable material which is what it is when we get down to the truth about it. I just think one of the biggest challenges we're going to see for many companies, whether in the packaging industry or not, when it comes to plastics of any type, is backpedaling all of the misinformation that we've heard that has largely been sent out into the world and consumed by the public and considered to be scientific fact when that is the antithesis of the truth.
Ugh, Nate, you are singing my song. I can't remember how many years ago it was. It was pre-COVID, so it was either 2018 or 2019. I think it was 2018. I was at an industry event, a trade show, and there was a speaker on stage talking about their major brand owner, multinational brand owner. I don't want to name them because I'm about to diss them, but multinational, major CPG company, head of sustainable packaging on stage, talking about, for the first time that I heard any brand owner say this out loud in a public forum, that one of their goals, one of their sustainable packaging goals, was to eliminate plastic. Number one, I was shocked that they would say that, knowing that the person who was saying this is a packaging person and should have known better. And number two, what was the second thing I was going to say? Oh, poop. Oh, well, okay, there were two things. I can't remember what the second thing is. Anyway, I couldn't believe that they said that. He said that on stage in public, because exactly as you said, Nate, now that they've caved in to consumer misinformation to make these packaging decisions, when more information gets out, and come on, how long did it take me to explain the value of PET? Less than a minute? Maybe two? Not very long, okay? Simple, like there were three, maybe four reasons why PET is so valuable as a packaging material from a recycling point of view, from a circular economy point of view. Well, wasn't that hard, okay? Brand, why not fight? You know better. Why not fight? How hard is it going to be, like you say, to, once more people are educated on the value of plastic for as a packaging material, how hard is it going to be for all these brand owners to undo their message of, plastic packaging is bad?
Yeah, I think you've brought up some very important discussion topics. I'm really glad that you're here on the show today, particularly because, well, as I've mentioned in the past, I consider you a celebrity in the packaging industry. So hopefully this will get in front of quite a few listeners. And I think it's very important because, you mentioned one, very high up C-level executive for a specific company. I've seen probably three or four extremely large multinational companies publish articles on LinkedIn in the past month or two that are essentially doing the same things. And if we back up a little bit before we go into the next question, which we will shortly, you mentioned, it has to be financially viable. And I think one of the unfortunate realities that we're facing today is that many of these, or at least a collection of these multinational companies, and when you think about the really, really big players in the game, it doesn't, take a ton of them to start, caving to these ideas in the public, as you said. And it is a big problem because it is going to be much harder to step back and say, as it turns out, we were wrong. And to go back to the financial piece, you talk about PET and you talk about, why would companies want to do away with that? And I think these examples of these major C-level executives and some of these companies who are producing this content and saying these things in public are doing it because of the pressure from the public. And I think that comes back to finance because while there's many reasons for PET exclusively, as well as I'm sure various other types of plastics, you would want to keep them, recycle them, and reuse them in whatever ways possible, and that there's a viable financial gain from that. Unfortunately, I think some companies are saying, well, at the same time, if we give into public perception, then there's going to be financial rewards for that as well. So I think a big kind of scary thing is that we're coming to a point where corporations understand that there is a financial value on both sides of this coin. And I think, based on what I've watched in the world of corporate business, there are some companies who, even if they know better, will deliberately step on the wrong side of the story here and continue to play to the public rather than do what's hard. I think we're coming to a point in human history, in corporate business, where everyone is going to have to make an uncomfortable choice, and that's the choice between what is easy and what is right.
Yes. And you know what, Nate, that is the difference between a leader and someone who's not a leader, in my opinion. But you know what? I love all this that we've been talking about. I do think that the issue of recycled, post-consumer recycled content is so important that I want to go back to that for a little bit and talk about, because the success is not just PET packaging. There's so many other containers, so many other packages that I want to talk about. So aluminum beverage containers cycle from an empty can back to a full can in record time, 60 days can to can, according to the Can Manufacturers Institute. Okay. Um, Aluminum is infinitely recyclable, which is pretty cool. There's a lot more to it as far as the economics of it, that it's more economical for a can manufacturer to use recycled aluminum than virgin aluminum. So there's that, as we were talking about, that economic incentive for all the players in the game. Paper packaging, like cartons and paper bags, also have a very high recycling rate. The one thing about fiber, though, is it does have a limit. The same piece of fiber, or the same fiber, if you break it down to its individual component, does have a limit on the number of times that it can be recycled into another fiber product. And that's why a lot of paper packages only use a percentage of recycled fiber in it. For example, 10%, 20% recycled content instead of 100%, although there is the 100% Recycled Paperboard Alliance. I'm not sure they've got the name 100% correct. 100% Recycled Paperboard Alliance. Yeah, I think that's what it is. Anyway, so, aluminum and paper, and then other plastics that are widely used in packaging are maybe seeing a little bit more interest because of chemical recycling, which truly makes the plastic not have because plastics do have a limit. The polymers do have a limit too when they're processed through mechanical recycling, but chemical recycling, because it takes it all the way back down to its polymers, that kind of is a non-issue then for plastics, as far as like having a limit on how many times the same plastic can be recycled. And then earlier you mentioned glass. So glass also, like aluminum, is infinitely recyclable. So, as we've already talked about, the secret is making sure that the material has a demand, has a market as a recyclate at the end of the life, because the economics are just going to keep that cycle going. And again, at the beginning, I talked about circularity really being the goal of packaging sustainability, and not necessarily just like end of life recycling and or renewable materials at the beginning of life, and it's really the whole cycle. Um, so if a packaging material isn't economically viable, in my opinion, um, regulation, creativity, and then patience and subsidies are going to be needed uh, to get the cycle going, hopefully, and then get the cycle to be self-fulfilling. But because it costs money to recycle packaging, and someone's got to pay. Ultimately, of course, like anything else, it's the consumer that pays. But to answer the earlier, the main question that you asked is, how do I think companies that want to include more PCR in their packaging can do so? Here's my answer. Ask for it and pay for it. Pay for the recycled material. Even if virgin material is cheaper, if you can, because there's a lot of companies that can't afford to do that. And then again, let the consumer know. Get all the eco cred you can for using recycled material in your packaging, especially if you're paying more for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of that is absolutely fantastic feedback. Thank you for that. And there could be some reiteration here, but I did want to move on officially to the fifth question, which is it's a little wordy, so bear with me here. Plastic packaging has come under fire with each passing year, particularly when the public learned about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. For this reason and others, many people, including C-level executives and politicians, are pushing to limit or altogether ban plastics. Can you tell us why this is not a good move in regards to sustainability and provide some insights on plastic packaging that people may not be aware of?
Okay, we've talked about some of it already, but early in my career, someone told me that every packaging material has its pros and cons. And over the decades, I've been a packaging journalist now. Earlier this year, I celebrated my 40th anniversary as a journalist. Thank you. And over those 4 decades, what I've learned really does prove that out. That's why it's kind of exciting and challenging to compare one material over the other, because they all have pros and they all have cons. So, as we already talked about, plastics has gotten beaten up in the general media and continues to get beaten up. And yet, again, as we've already talked about, the reality is in many cases, plastic packaging is the best sustainable choice, especially when you're looking at circularity, like PET bottles and aluminum cans. We've already talked about that. So again, for the brand owners to cave in to consumer sentiment without even trying to educate them just makes me so sad. And as I said already, most people will understand the pros and cons of a packaging material if it's explained to them. And that's what I think we should do. Explain it to consumers. And I know that's not easy because, again, how do you do it in limited space on the package? You could do it on your webs. You could do it in so many ways. So much information is digitized these days, which doesn't take any space at all on a package. Well, maybe a QR code that takes you to a website. Understand our packaging choice, QR code. Bam, you're done. But I do acknowledge that it is an uphill battle. I do. I know that the brand owners who can do this best are going to succeed the most.
That's fantastic, and I completely agree. And you The answer that you just provided pretty much answered the following question, number 6. So I'm just going to skip over that because it was succinct, it was tactful, and I think it's pretty clear. It really comes down to educating the consumer, providing access to that information, whether that is a QR code, whether you print it on the packaging itself, a website, so on and so forth. So we have a good idea of the how.
Yeah. Nate, I did, I'm so sorry. I did have something though that I wanted to, a little bit more that I wanted to say on that. That's, the brand owners really need, and we've talked about this already, need to stop taking the easy way out. But basically what they're doing is they're letting a misinformed public make the packaging decisions for them. And as we know, packaging is a science as much as it is an art. So, life cycle data, those are hard numbers. It's available. Try different explanations, different arguments, be persuasive. And one of the main reasons that I think consumers think that plastic packaging is bad today is because the vast majority of it is single use, and that generates a lot of garbage. So you're seeing the volume of this, which exasperates the problem. Packaging, empty packaging is a problem because it generates a lot of garbage, and we see it. It's very visible. But plastics, when they're in a reusable or refillable format, makes as much sense as any other packaging material, maybe even more. And one of the examples that I wanted to point out here is when I got married, I got a bunch of Tupperware containers for my bridal shower. And I still have some of those Tupperware containers that I got decades ago. And so do a lot of other people, I'm sure. It might not be what the folks at Tupperware want to hear because they want to sell more containers, but it's the truth. So I was absolutely thrilled when I heard the news in early 2021 that Tupperware was partnering with the Loop initiative of reusable packaging, which you already mentioned. We talked a little bit about Loop already. And so far, Tim Hortons and Burger King have already launched their Tupperware branded containers for those Loop programs that they have. And I reached out to the folks at Loop just yesterday, and I'm told that there are more developments in the works for future packages coming from brand owners on that, which is a little exciting. But again, that partnership proves that plastic is a viable material, a durable material, a reusable packaging material that fits with the sustainability mindset.
I 100% agree with that. And I'm very excited to hear that Loop is working with plastic containers as well as some heavier materials like glass and metal. I was unaware of that, so I'll certainly be digging in to do more research about that. And that gives me hope for reusable packaging, hopefully veering more towards the use of plastics because, if nothing else, the carbon footprint and what reusing those containers would do for the environment. And, so you mentioned Loop. Obviously, there are probably some folks at TerraCycle who could answer questions that consumers may have about sustainability, which does dovetail joint nicely into the next question, which are, who are some of the most knowledgeable people in the packaging industry with a true knowledge base of plastics' environmental impact?
I have so many sources who are excellent, but I am going to tell you about a few people and organizations that I think highly of, mostly because they keep learning what it is that they need to learn about the technologies and options and methods. And they're also able to assess those technologies and options and methods from a variety of perspectives. So from the point of view of the consumer and the brand owner and the recycler and, all of that, the package manufacturer. But the first one that I'm going to talk about, I'm not as familiar with the folks who are working at the Sustainable Packaging Coalition now, because there's been recent staff changes, including at the leadership level, and I just haven't had time to reach out to them and develop those relationships, strong relationships, like I had with some of the folks who've left. But this organization, SPC, has been indispensable since its creation in 2005. And they've been indispensable in identifying, explaining, and advising on the key issues of packaging sustainability. Indispensable. Next, I've had the pleasure of working with David Luttenberger in the past, and I appreciate his analysis of developments. I think I mentioned him earlier. He's the global packaging director at Mintel, the consumer insights company. He's the one who wants to change sustainable packaging to be better descriptive, and he came up with the term responsible packaging. Yep. Also, I have thoroughly enjoyed every conversation I have had with Bob Lilienfeld, and I've learned something from every article of his that I've read. He has an absolute gift of being able to logically and thoughtfully propose new ideas. And I don't know if you knew this or not, but not all ideas are new. So I would like to say thank you, Bob, for all your new ideas. His recent initiative is SPRING, SPRING, and it stands for something, sustainable packaging something or other, that I don't remember right now, but he is very active on LinkedIn. I also respect Tom Szaky, the founder of TerraCycle and Loop, the Loop initiative. I respect him for what he's done and how he's influenced top executives with these brand owner companies. And it's not just packaging people that he's influenced. I mean, he's gone to the CEO level of the brand owner companies and gotten them interested and on board with sustainable packaging. Tom's timing and his sense of marketing are unparalleled. I consider him a real leader. I actually call him the Steve Jobs of packaging sustainability. And there's one more, Ameripen. So Ameripen is a material agnostic organization that focuses on the science of packaging and intercedes on behalf of the industry with regulatory bodies. And good or bad, moving forward, we're going to see a lot more activity on the regulatory front related to packaging and sustainability. So we're going to need organizations like Ameripen more than ever. So just to quickly recap, my go-to experts for sustainable packaging: SPC, the Sustainable Packaging Coalition; David Luttenberger; Bob Lilienfeld; Tom Szaky; and Ameripen. And I am so grateful that you asked that question so that I can give these people some recognition for the jobs that they're doing.
And I am so grateful that not only did you go over them, but you re-itemized them into an audible bullet list at the end. That'll make my job a lot easier to come up with links to put in the description below the show. Listeners, once we reach the end of the show, you'll be able to find links to content from each of these people that Lisa just mentioned. So thank you very much for sharing that information with us. All right, so the next two questions are sort of together, if you will, and it's pretty straightforward. Are you willing to pay more for a product if it has truly sustainable packaging? Why or why not?
Yes, but like any, but like any other consumer that you ask, especially in today's economy, I'm going to push back and say, why should I have to pay more? But before we get into that, first, even with the knowledge and experience that I have as a journalist covering this topic, would I even be able to recognize that a package was truly sustainable? And I bring this up because, and I think I forgot to mention this when we were talking about post-consumer recycled content. So a brand owner puts post-consumer recycled content in its package. How does the consumer know if they don't tell them? If they don't tell the consumer? I would not even be able to know. If I looked at a PET bottle, would I know that that was 100% virgin or if it was, 80% recycled content? I would not know. But also, I recognize that as a consumer, I play a very small part in the total ecosystem of a package. I use it to access a product just like everybody else does. And then I do what I think is the best option of disposal that's available to me. And like every other consumer out there, so much about the end of life is beyond my control. And we've already talked about how any type of packaging to succeed from a sustainability point of view, it really has to be economically viable um, as in the cycle, the life cycle of the package. So if a product, not a package, but a product costs more because it's truly sustainable, and that's in air quotes, truly sustainable packaging choice costs more because let's say, for example, it's a new biomaterial or whatever that's just making its way into the market. Um, Thankfully, literally, I'm so grateful for this that I'm currently in a position where I could pay more to support that. But I'm going to argue that most consumers are never able or willing to pay more these days, especially these days.
I would absolutely agree with that. I think that's the best answer to the question that I've received. I've asked this to a few guests on the show, and they certainly aren't usually as succinct. So I appreciate the fact you go on the extra mile and saying, yes, one, you would do it, and two, it would be nice to see companies maybe eat that cost if possible, because with everything we've lived through in the past few years, the pandemic, the supply chain disruptions, strikes of various kinds, hopefully, which we will not be seeing again with the railroad, which is yet to be seen. We're certainly living in times where, every penny counts. And I think it's important that corporations, where possible, make these products easier to buy because I think many consumers may not do it, considering the situations that we're all currently living through as a species today. All right, well, that brings us to the last question, and this is one of my favorite questions. I've asked it to about a dozen guests on my show, and that is, what is your favorite type of sustainable packaging?
I like this question a lot too. Okay, so again, all packaging materials have their pros and cons. But I guess I would have to say that the aluminum beverage can is my favorite type of sustainable packaging because it is probably the closest to being truly circular. Again, I'm going to reiterate some of the points that I made earlier, or maybe I made these earlier. It's has one of the highest recycling rates of any package, and this is according to statistics from the Aluminum Association and the Can Manufacturers Institute. So 2020 numbers, um, the recycling rate of aluminum beverage cans by industry 59.7%. That goes back to the post-industrial recycled, okay? And then by consumers, which I would have thought that would be a whole lot higher than, like 60%. But anyway, I'll take the 60%, which is pretty high. But the recycling rate by consumers for aluminum beverage cans is 45.2%. Okay, so that's one point that I wanted to make. Another point is the aluminum beverage can is often recycled right back into another aluminum beverage can with a little bit of reprocessing in between. So on average, and this is a quote, this next sentence is a quote that I got from the Aluminum Association and Can Manufacturers Institute. Quote, on average, 92.6% of recycled aluminum can material is made back into an aluminum can, unquote. So this we didn't get a chance to talk about closed loop systems for recycled materials or not. And different people have different definitions of what closed loop recycling means. Some people believe that it's a loop that is controlled by from the manufacturer to the through the consumer and then back to the manufacturer. But other people think that a closed loop recycling system means that a package is recycled right back into the same package. And that's what aluminum cans do. So that's that. And that material is turned around pretty quickly, 60 days from a recycled can to a new can, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, third, the infrastructure supporting the process is well established and used. Most people know to recycle aluminum beverage cans, and most people know how. So, bottom line, it's there's an economic incentive for virtually everyone involved in the system. It costs less for the can manufacturers to make a can from recycled material than virgin. I think I mentioned that earlier, which means that the recycling facilities have a market for the recycled material. So there's a demand that exists there. Brand owners can very easily tout the easy recyclability of the package and win points with consumers on that end. And even at the consumer levels, in some instances, consumers can get paid for bringing cans to a recycling facilities. So there's a lot of wins here that other materials are jealous of and actually strive for. Now, someone might argue that maybe I should have picked corrugated boxes because they have even higher recycling rate, 96.5% in 2018, according to the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. But as we talked about a little bit earlier, fiber does have a limited number of cycles that it can go through for recycling, whereas, aluminum doesn't. It's infinitely recyclable. So you know what? I'm going to stick with my first choice. My favorite sustainable package is the aluminum beverage can.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa, for that answer. I too am a fan of aluminum cans. I drink quite a lot of Polar Seltzer. I don't know if you guys have that from where you are. Polar is a beverage company up here in New England. I've been drinking their carbonated water probably since I was 7 or 8 years old. But with that said, I just want to thank you so much for your time today. This is one of the most profound episodes of the podcast I've ever recorded. I've done my best not to fanboy too hard while you've been here as our guest, and I certainly hope that there will be an opportunity in the future to have you back on the show.
I would be happy to come back anytime. It's one of my favorite things to talk about packaging. I hope I lived up to what you think of me.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that does it for another episode of the Industrial Packaging Podcast with me, your host, Nathan Dube, Digital Marketing Specialist at Industrial Packaging. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I hope you will tune in for the next one. But until then, I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next time.